This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. We'd like to note that although the following interview does not present graphic detail, it will include reference to murder and sexual assault. Next week, Brian Dorsey is set to become the first person executed in the state of Missouri this year. In 2006, Dorsey turned himself in for murdering his cousin, Sarah Bonney, and her husband, Ben Bonney, in their bed. It was a brutal case that involved theft and alleged sexual assault. The couple's 4-year-old daughter was in another room during the killing. She was found there alone when relatives came to see why the Bonnies hadn't shown up for a Christmas gathering, only adding to the tragedy and horror of the crime. 2 years later, Dorsey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of capital murder. A Boone County jury recommended capital punishment. Dorsey appealed, but the Missouri Supreme Court, including its Chief Justice Judge Michael A. Wolff, upheld the conviction. 17 years have passed since Brian Dorsey was sent to death row at Potosi State Prison. In that time, he's been a model inmate. He's had 0 infractions and served as barber. And now retired Judge Michael Wolff has joined dozens of people, including past and present corrections officers and even a former prison warden, who've signed their names to the executive clemency petition that sits before Missouri Governor Mike Parson. If Governor Parson grants clemency, Brian Dorsey will spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. If not, next Tuesday, April 9th, Brian Dorsey will become the 7th person executed in the state of Missouri since 2022. Joining me in studio to talk about that clemency petition and why he's among those who feel Brian Dorsey deserves to live, we have retired Missouri Supreme Court Judge and St. Louis University School of Law Professor Emeritus Michael Wolff. Judge Wolff, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Now, Dorsey has appealed on multiple occasions since his conviction in 2008. Now, during your time on the Missouri Supreme Court, you and your colleagues, Judge, upheld Dorsey's death sentence. What was your reasoning and understanding at that time?
At that time, what we had in the record before us was that Mr. Dorsey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder. He did not plead to a sexual assault count. That was alleged. It was brought up, I think, in the sentencing process. He was represented by 2 lawyers at the trial, which is very common for death penalty cases. But we didn't know exactly what the quality of that representation was in terms of the preparation and any negotiations that might have gone on. All we knew were the facts of the case. And I have to tell you that every murder case, the facts are terrible. So we understand that. The job of the jury in the first instance is to sort out, is this person one of the worst of the worst? Or is this somebody who should be given life in prison without possibility of parole?
Right.
And then I found out subsequently how poor the representation was of Mr. Dorsey by the 2 lawyers who were hired on a flat fee basis by the public defender. So they got paid the same amount regardless of how much work they did. And there was, as it turns out, some fairly clear evidence that he was in a drug-induced psychosis. He had something. It's not I don't think it's a very good defense to the murder charge itself, but it allows the jury to consider that in mitigation. That is, should this really be a person for whom we would recommend the death penalty?
Right. We're going to return to some of that around the flat fees and the defending attorneys. But I want to clarify something about your role in the case. You are not the judge of Dorsey's trial. In 2008, Brian Dorsey pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, and a jury sentenced him to death. And then as Supreme Court Justice, you voted to uphold this conviction. And that's something that we mischaracterized in some of the promos that we ran before this conversation. So we just want to be very clear. What does it mean, Judge, that you upheld the jury's sentence? What's different about upholding something?
Well, when the case comes to the Supreme Court of Missouri, either in death cases, it's a direct appeal from the trial court to the Supreme Court. Our first task is review for legal errors, and of course, in this case, there was a plea of guilty, and so the trial judge went through the elements of what he was pleading guilty to, and so there didn't appear to be any error there. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a factual record as to what investigation the lawyers did. There is a second proceeding in due course after, if we uphold the judgment and the sentence that's given, then it goes back. There's a second hearing. Mm-hmm. And in that case, the question was, did he get adequate representation by his lawyers?
I see.
And the objections that have subsequently been developed were defaulted at that time. They didn't appear even then. Mm-hmm. I wasn't on the court when the appeal from that second proceeding came up. I retired in 2011. Mm-hmm. But it's significant in the first appeal that there isn't any such evidence about how much work the lawyers did or whatever.
Right. So then that brings us back to that question. You'd mentioned flat fees. Brian Dorsey mm-hmm. was represented, I'm going to use that word very liberally, given what you've just shared, mm-hmm. to defend Dorsey, but they did not do what they were supposed to do. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think that first, the starting point, of course, is that Mr. Dorsey turned himself in. He acknowledged that he had committed, he had killed these two people. And so the investigation at that point turns to, well, what are the circumstances? And included in that is, what are the mental circumstances that you look for in terms of the state of that person's mind? And the fact of the matter is that you want to sort out and to present to the jury, if it's the jury, and it is the jury that will be deciding whether or not to recommend death. Mm-hmm. The sentence is actually imposed by the trial judge, and the sentence is reviewed by the Supreme Court as well as to whether or not it is proportional to other crimes of murder. Mm-hmm. And so so without that information for the jury, and by the way, I think 5 of the people who sat on that jury have in recent months said, if we had known this, mm-hmm. might have reached a different result. Some of them would have. Well, it would only take one of them to say, no, we can't. We can't do a death penalty on this. And if one of them had disagreed,
At that time,
mm-hmm. there'd be no death penalty. Then it would default to a life without possibility of parole.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, Judge Wolff, when is poor legal representation reason enough to pursue something other than a sentence as originally issued? And mm-hmm. when is it not?
I think the assumption that the courts make is that when somebody has a lawyer, in fact, in death penalty cases, you'll have 2 lawyers. And the reason for this is that most death penalty cases that go to trial on both, first of all, whether or not he was guilty of the offenses. Mm-hmm. He pleaded to that.
Sure.
The second lawyer's job, if there's been a trial where the issue might be, did he do it or not? Mm-hmm. Well, after the jury comes back and said, yes, he did, he is guilty of first-degree murder, you have a second lawyer, and oftentimes the role of the second lawyer is the first one's already spent his credibility or her credibility arguing that he wasn't guilty. So you have somebody fresh come and say, look, now we have some mitigating circumstances. Now we have some things that the jury should consider in determining whether or not the circumstances that are aggravating, the things that are horrifying about this individual and the crime that he committed, that it would justify or not justify the death penalty. Mm-hmm. The prosecution will be putting on evidence that they think would impel the jury to recommend the death penalty. Mm-hmm. And again, as I say, the jurors really felt that they were not adequately informed, and that's an interesting point.
We're speaking with retired Missouri Supreme Court Judge and St. Louis University School of Law Professor Emeritus Michael A. Wolff, and we're discussing the executive clemency petition that has been put forth by Brian Dorsey, who is scheduled to be executed next Tuesday, April 9th. Judge Wolff, do you think that there are limitations that judges have in cases such as the one that we're discussing around Brian Dorsey, where there is poor legal representation? I mean, what kinds of limitations are judges looking at?
Well, in the course of things, especially in cases where the state has had the right to take this man's life because of the judgment of the court, I think it's particularly that we look especially closely at what kind of representation he had. What facts did the jury know? What facts did the jury not know? Mm-hmm. And so I think in this case it was particularly egregious that there was almost nothing done. There is the lawyer who represented him on the direct appeal really felt that these two lawyers basically told him when he was going in for his hearing, "You're going to plead guilty." Mm-hmm. And and by the way, that could be done if you make a good argument to the prosecutor that you've got enough evidence to persuade the jury that this guy should not be executed. You might very well agree to plead him guilty to the offense as long as they take the death penalty off the table. They didn't do that.
Right.
It's pretty common for them to do that. And one of the things that struck me in going through the things that have recently come out is that Brian Dorsey's football coach, the legendary Pete Atkins, who coached many years at the Jefferson City High School, mm-hmm. wrote an op-ed in the Jefferson City newspaper saying, "This is a good kid. I'm sorry I didn't know he had these troubles. Maybe I could have helped him," because there was this time. He has also, I should add, been, while he's in prison,
yes,
17 years with not a single infraction, and he's the barber for the correctional officers, and that means they're trusting him with scissors and razors and things like that. Mm-hmm. So he is not. They consider him to be a model prisoner.
Right.
And 72 of them have signed statements that they don't think he's of the worst who should be executed. Mm-hmm. Now, this is not a group that is anti-death penalty. Right. So and then of course one of the wardens that served, I suppose, at the time when he's been in prison.
Mm-hmm. And so, corrections officers, as we talked about in the introduction, as you've noted as well, and one of the past wardens has said that Brian Dorsey is an outstanding inmate. I mean, is the fact that someone is well-liked within the prison, is that a fair way to assess who should and shouldn't receive the death penalty after conviction?
You know what's interesting about that question? I think it's a really good question, because the legal system can only do so much. Judges in appeals can look at the record and see what was presented and see what the jury decided. What the governor gets to do, and it's a power that's given to the executive in the American system, and it comes from the British system and from the sovereign. Although we don't have sovereigns here, we have governors.
Sure.
And the governor gets to review and say, well, is this somebody that I should give clemency or mercy to? And so the quality of mercy can be exercised by a jury if they have a good reading of the facts. Mm-hmm. But when you miss that opportunity, the only quality of mercy left is with the governor. It's up to him. Mm-hmm. And I think Governor Parson takes his role very seriously. He has caught up with a lot of, kind of ordinary pardons and commutations that come routinely to the governor's office in a way that his predecessors did not. So he has been, and as a former sheriff, he understands that there's good guys and bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes good guys commit crimes.
Right.
I mean, they're not good when they've committed the crimes, but the fact of the matter is that they're not irredeemably evil.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is the situation here, and that's why there's some hope that that the governor will see this as an apt place for an application of mercy.
Brian Dorsey was convicted of murder only. You
By
mentioned
his plea,
that.
yes.
Right. But prosecutors alleged that Dorsey didn't just murder this couple, but afterwards that he sexually assaulted the body of one of his victims. Mm-hmm. This shocks the conscience, but does it make an impact on this case? Should it matter that jurors were thinking about this as they deliberated?
I think that well, first of all, I don't think that he would have pleaded guilty to the murders and to the sexual assault. I think that was very much at issue. But then when you get to the point of asking a jury, should this person be executed, that can be one of the aggravating factors if he did that. But he's not been convicted of that, and he has not admitted it. Now, there was some evidence of that. The other evidence, of course, that was entirely missed was the evidence of his drug-induced psychosis. I don't know what those facts are, but it could cut either way, and that is that was he totally out of character, crazy? I mean, that's what his football coach thought.
Right.
Was that this is something that was an aberration to who he was, and this was somebody who had coached him in high school, very intense sport, and knew him very well. Mm-hmm. So I think that those things have to be taken into account. So is it fair to bring up something that was alleged but not proven beyond a reasonable doubt? Mm-hmm. Probably not, but the law allows them to bring that up and to prove it by a preponderance of evidence. Is it more likely true than not true? Mm-hmm. So if you had that the jury decide whether or not he actually committed a sexual assault, they would have had a much higher burden of proof. So I think that it may seem horrific if he really did that, but also we haven't proved that by the law's standards of beyond a reasonable doubt.
Something that we want to make sure that we address is that there are those who are not in favor of clemency, and that includes family members of those who were killed, Sarah and Ben Bonney.
Some of the family members, yes. That's
some
correct.
Of them, yes.
Some of them are in favor of clemency.
Right.
So it's a split family, as you would obviously think that would be possible.
Sure,
True.
Sure. Then, insofar as closure, for those who are not in favor, what do you say to those who feel like justice delivered will be carrying through the sentence of the death penalty?
Yes, I think that's a fair point. The one thing that I would say is that this person is going to be in prison every day of his life, and every day of his life he can think about what he did. And so in that, and by the way, it's not an easy life being in prison. Mm-hmm. It's not an easy life to be there and to know you'll never get out. And so I think that's the and so for some people there's an eye for an eye quality about this. I mean it oftentimes comes about what you believe about that kind of justice. But we don't really do an eye for an eye. We don't take somebody's eye out if they put somebody else's eye out. Mm-hmm. But there is that proportionality of punishment that that we look at sometimes through a religious or faith-based lens. Obviously, in this case, the bishops of the Catholic Church in Missouri have all, and they do this in every death penalty case, that they reflect the Church's position that the state ought not to take life. Mm-hmm. And so, but people will vary about that. And in fact, I don't think that necessarily even all Catholics agree with their bishops. Mm-hmm. But that's the official position of the Church.
As you look back on the decisions that you were part of, is there some guilt that you grapple with? How does your own conscience? You are a judge, but you are a human being.
Well, when I applied for the job in 1998, there were a lot more death penalty cases in Missouri then than there are now. This is something that comes and goes in kind of a fascinating way. There was a period of time around 2004 where there were no juries in Missouri that issued death recommendations. Mm-hmm. What was going on in the world was that in Illinois, the governor, they had a number of innocence cases, and the governor had commuted the sentences of all people on death row. I think a lot of people who were going to be serving as jurors around that time thought, well, that's not, if they make that many mistakes, how can we do that when the stakes are life and death?
Right.
But I think going into the job and taking the job as a judge, you agree to do the law, to follow the law. Mm-hmm. The law in Missouri, which has been upheld on its constitutional basis, allows the state to take life. If I were truly unable to do that, then maybe I shouldn't have been a judge. But I have voted in cases where the law clearly showed that the person could. But I have to tell you, in death cases, I took a careful look. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's part of the conscience. I don't have regret about that, but you always have to look back and say, well, did we know everything we needed to know to make that judgment? Mm-hmm. No, that's not a matter of guilt. That's just a matter of human nature re-examining significant decisions. Mm-hmm.
Judge, you resigned from the Missouri Supreme Court in 2011.
Yes.
Do you see Missouri's death penalty law in a different way now than you did years ago?
Not particularly. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, there's a couple of things that have interested me. One is that when we select people, or when we exclude people from serving as jurors, we exclude the people who say they can't do the death penalty. Well, okay, that's, quote, fair to the state. But if we exclude, if 45% or 50% of the people in Missouri don't agree with the death penalty, so we're only going to take our jurors from the other half, that may not be a fair jury in terms of wanting to have a cross-section. Mm-hmm. So I think it's difficult to do that, to have a system that respects the traditions of our law and still allows the death penalty to be imposed. It also involves other costs. I think that people who serve on juries and recommend death sentences, some of them do have guilt, psychological ramifications, and so forth. So we impose that cost on folks that are just showing up to do their civic duty. Mm-hmm. Some of them gladly do it, don't get me wrong. But some of them are the ones that you want as jurors are the ones who are very thoughtful about it and might be influenced by that, because an awful lot of decision-making we make as human beings is based not only on facts but on emotions.
Yes, indeed. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this.
Nice to be with you. Thank you.
The Honorable Michael Wolff is a retired Missouri Supreme Court judge and professor emeritus at St. Louis University School of Law, where he served as a dean from 2013 to 2017. We're talking about the clemency petition for Brian Dorsey, who is set to receive the death penalty next week, April 9th, by the state of Missouri. We need to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear a response to Judge Wolff's comments from an activist dedicated to abolishing the death penalty in Missouri. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. Before the break, we heard from retired Missouri Supreme Court Judge Michael A. Wolff, who served as Chief Justice when Brian Dorsey, a Missouri man, was sentenced to death for the murders of Sarah and Ben Bonney in 2006. Judge Wolff is among dozens who have signed Brian Dorsey's clemency petition to Governor Mike Parson. Parson's response to that petition will determine Dorsey's fate, whether he serves a commuted sentence of life in prison without parole or becomes the first person Missouri executes this year on April 9th. Here to continue this conversation about the execution of Brian Dorsey and the significance of the support he's now receiving in the larger context of advocacy around abolishing the death penalty in Missouri, I'm here with Michelle Smith, founder of the Missouri Justice Coalition and co-director of the Missourians to Abolish the Death Penalty organization. Michelle, thank you so much for joining us again.
Elaine, thank you for having me.
Michelle, as you were listening to Judge Wolff's comments, what was it that struck you most overall? And was there anything about them that surprised you in any way?
Well, of course, Judge Wolff is a very respected member of the legal community here in St. Louis, and we greatly appreciate him speaking out. And honestly, just him speaking out in reviewing the case of Mr. Dorsey about, his role in that appellate process and in acknowledging that, had he had more facts and information, he would have made a different decision. So that in itself is remarkable, and it is also something that does not happen on a usual basis in these cases.
Mm-hmm. Now, the details of this case, they're very hard to read and they're disturbing. And that isn't unique for a death penalty case, and that is something that Judge Wolff also brought up in his comments. The people your group is advocating for, Michelle, they've done some terrible things. What is it that you would say to those who are horrified by the crime that Dorsey committed, who believe that an execution can provide victims with some closure? How would you approach that?
Well, Elaine, overall, when I talk to people about the work that we do, I never shy away from the fact that, yes, people have committed, some horrible acts, and that we can't shy away from that because that's the reality of the situation, and there are still people grieving, family members grieving. But what I do tell people is when we talk about the death penalty, I need people to understand that the death penalty itself is arbitrary, and that means that not everyone that commits, certain heinous cases receive the death penalty. Mm-hmm. Brian did and others did, but there are other people who are incarcerated who did things just as heinous, right? And they were not facing execution or facing a death penalty sentence. So the fact that this is a punishment that is very arbitrary depending upon the political climate, the prosecutors, what type of a record they want to hold or their legacy, etc., that really determines if a person receives a death penalty sentence, and just the arbitrary nature of it really diminishes what justice should be for the victims' families.
Mm-hmm. Now, There was also a January 2024 petition for clemency that was signed by 60 Missouri corrections officers and the prisoner's former warden. Now, that was not organized by the Missourians to abolish the death penalty. But what is it to you that is most significant about that support specifically for Brian Dorsey?
Well, I'll first start by saying that number is now over 70 former and current corrections officers. And I know that Judge Wolff spoke about how that is definitely an extraordinary situation that has never happened before in a death penalty case in our state where so many corrections officers have come out. But I want to make sure that the listeners understand the position these officers are in. This is a job where you're not necessarily looked upon in the best light when you come out and say, hey, this person, that's incarcerated that I have to, monitor every day, that I am supporting them, in this court process. And so these officers actually are not necessarily in danger, don't get me wrong, but this is something putting their reputations on the line. This is something where, it's not easy for them to come forward, which again is why they normally do not come forward. But it is something that they definitely took into consideration, not only the former Warden Steele, but also all of the corrections officers, particularly the ones that still work within the Missouri Department of Corrections. This is something that is unprecedented because they also are putting themselves on the line with signing this letter. And, even some of them have written individual letters to Governor Parson. And so this is truly extraordinary. And it goes to the character of Mr. Dorsey, but not also his character today, right? Because, he has become a better person since he's been incarcerated, but it also goes to, let me step back. Some of these officers have been there the entire time he's been incarcerated, right? Some of them have been, COs for 20 years. So it really talks about even from the time, that he first was incarcerated and his growth over the years, and then becoming the staff barber, these officers have seen him for the last 17 years and seen how much he's changed, how remorseful he is. They've had those conversations with him. So for them to put themselves on the line, they truly believe that Brian deserves clemency, and he is not someone who should be facing execution.
Now, Michelle, in our last minute, you recently visited Jeff City to lobby elected officials about the death penalty overall and about Dorsey's clemency petition efforts. What did you hear from officials about their stance on the death penalty? Are their positions changing?
I think overall our state legislature is changing, not also changing, but just realizing that we don't need the death penalty. Of course, not everyone, but I have spoken to electeds who say, well, the death penalty, I've never really taken a strong stance on it. So if we get to a place where more of our electeds are okay, many are willing to abolish the death penalty in our state. Again, because we still have prison. Prison is not going away. And so we don't need this ultimate punishment, not only because of the traumatic parts, but the money. It costs a lot of money to execute someone in our state.
Right.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski and Emily Woodbury.
Podcast design by Aaron Dorr and engineered by Emily Woodbury.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.